Oh, hey. Hello, hello. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I always forget there's not a countdown, so I'm like sitting there adjusting. It's not very interesting, but I have wide shoulders and a normal size neck, so I have to get a bigger shirt. So my neck thing is always so loose. And somebody commented once and was like, "Is that a tick?" And I'm like, "No, it just rubs against where I shaved." So, not very interesting story, but that's what they just caught me doing. So,
Love it. How has your week been, Chris? Can you believe we're already almost in February?
I know it's so funny because I always remember like January and February like speed by, and then like March, April, May go so slow, and yeah, but it's intense. It's crazy, 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 crazy. It's already
All right. So we are gonna hop in. I'm so excited. So I just want to kind of like acknowledge the elephant in the room that Fred's not here with us and we're not doing the talk we were gonna do. So I know today we were gonna talk a lot about accessibility and accessing treatment and what it's like to navigate treatment without insurance or with insurance when not everyone takes insurance. But Fred Penzel, who we really believe is the expert in this area and has written a lot on it, he is not he was not able to make it today. So we decided to punt that conversation because we really want to make sure that we're covering the same stuff and that we're covering the same stuff. That made no sense. We want to make sure that the expert to cover that area is here so that Chris and I don't try our best to cover, but we miss a lot because he's just going to bring so much more education and content to the area than we can. So what we're going to do today is we are going to kind of go back to, no, I guess it's not a lunch and learn. It's just an Ask the Experts. So we're really going to focus on Ask the Experts today. So we're going to do pre-submitted questions that are here, which we know you always have a million. So I'm not worried about us not having enough. But I want to make a promise and commitment that we are going to do that lunch and learn later. So we're hoping that we'll be able to get it done in February, but it may be March. But it will happen. So we will absolutely still be having a targeted webinar on how to use insurance, how to fight your insurance, how to get appropriate treatment, and how to access care.
which I think is such a good talk because I'm glad that Fred, I mean, I agree that we got to wait for Fred because he's been the one that I've seen talk at it at conference and present. But I know when I got treatment, there was no laws that allowed us to get reimbursed or to use insurance in any way. And so there's so many different laws and so many different ways to navigate now where people can get reimbursed or people can get single case agreements or in network. Like there's different things you can do. So I think a lot of times people feel discouraged. So having Fred Penzel in a talk is going to be great. So I hope everybody comes back for that. We'll announce it. Obviously, the IOCDF puts out dates and everything on iocdf.org/peace of mind. And then that way, if that's a talk that you find would be helpful for you to navigate insurance and ways to get reimbursement and get to treatment, please come back. We'd love to have you. So
I have an idea. So, like, I'm seeing you guys say hi to us and tell us where you're from, which y'all always do, and we love. And I just love seeing it. But I think we should petition that the foundation should send us to all the places that our guests live.
no, I know, especially because a lot of them live in places I want to travel to.
Yeah,
So
like
I'm always like, oh, like, oh.
y'all are joining from, it's like, oh, like we should come serve you in your area. So
I agree. I agree. I'm like, we could come do it live. We could do a live stream at the experts.
a live in-person event where you get to see us in the flesh. No, so welcome y'all. We're so excited to have everybody. And I don't know if y'all are feeling as like overwhelmed as I am, but for those of you who do or don't know or need to know, and I'm going to give you some extra stress, the IOCDF conference submissions are due in just a few days, like less than a week. And so make sure you're checking that out. And I want you to remember that conference submissions are not only for clinicians, they're for individuals with OCD. And that's how a lot of us began our advocacy work and our connection and work with the foundation. I know Chris and I both have spoken at the conference and did as a patient before we continued to proceed with our degree and becoming a clinician in the field. So definitely please check that out. You can go to iocdf.org and click on the conference section to learn more about all those upcoming deadlines. As always, today's webinar is intended to be educational and it's not intended to replace therapy or to be individual therapy. If you're in crisis or distress, IOCDF is not a crisis line. You should go to your local emergency room, or now you can call 988, which is the suicide and crisis hotline. Today, we're going to jump into questions. We have pre-submitted questions, but I know we'll get live questions. So if you have questions from recent webinars we've done that we haven't gotten to or things that are on your mind, please make sure you put those in the comment pane on the right-hand side of your screen so that Chris and I can answer them live. But let's hop in. Let's get to some questions and knock them off our list.
Yeah, so I think this is a good way to start. It says, "Good morning. Can you all talk a little bit about feelings of hopelessness? I'm at a point in my life where it feels impossible to recover." So, how did you prevent yourself from feeling hopeless if you've been, because we both dealt with OCD since we were young. Like, how did you deal with that hopelessness or feeling like you're never going to get better if the treatment isn't going the way you want it or you're having new triggers? How did you handle that?
Yeah, it's so tough. And I want to first start by saying that, I want to normalize that for individuals living with OCD and mental health conditions, the feeling of hopelessness is a normal feeling for us to experience, but it at the same time is not something we need to accept as our continued norm, right? So I want to normalize that it would make sense you're feeling that way if you're really struggling and if you don't feel like you're getting the right treatment or you have the right support to get your life back to functioning. But I don't want to accept that as being the norm. So, what I mean by that, for example, is that, I may have been feeling really hopeless at one time, but once I got treatment, that hopelessness could shift. And y'all know I always in my live streams with help and hope are always available. And for some of you, those may feel like empty words because you may not believe that. And I know Chris and I have both been in a place where even if someone said that, we may not have actually believed it or thought it was attainable, but it is. And with appropriate treatment, we can shift that. And so, what I want you to hold on to is I want you to hold on to why you want to fight OCD. What are the things you want to get back? Is it your life? Is it your freedom? Is it relationships? Is it your career? Is it your job? And I want that to help give us hope around, or at least motivation to kind of say, okay, I'm going to do the work, or I want to get the right treatment so that I can live the life I want, so that I can do these things that are important to me. And those sort of goals and kind of that greater good purpose setting, I think can really help instill some hope when we're not feeling hopeful. When we're feeling hopeless, I also don't want to send the message like you shouldn't feel like that and just don't feel that way, because we may feel that way and it's a valid feeling and it's real. But instead of us just feeling it, I want us to figure out how can we shift it and what's that going to mean. And oftentimes that means setting greater good goals and then setting specific OCD treatment goals that can help get us there.
Yeah, I was literally just going to add that I think one thing that helps with helplessness is having a why. We all have to have a why to do treatment. And Liz and I are submitting a talk on kind of how to really understand and comprehend and revamp the messaging of ERP. And I think sometimes people think of it as like the whole reason I'm doing an exposure is to feel really, really a lot of anxiety and to feel really intense. And hopefully one day I'll get over it. And that's not how I pictured my treatment. I really pictured it as like I have these things that were really, really important to me. I was an athlete. I always had a big group of friends. I'm Greek. We have a big family. I always spent time with them. And all those things whittled away because of the OCD. So I envisioned like the OCD standing in my way. And the point of treatment was to say, look, going to family events is hard. I'm going to have intrusive sexual thoughts about family members, harm thoughts about some of those family members, and I can either choose to kind of run away and be scared, or my why is to fight and to get that relationship back. I really feel like that kind of triumphs over that hopelessness, is having a really good clear goal of why to put yourself into the place where you're putting yourself and engaging in treatment.
Totally, and work with your therapist on this. I think sometimes we get so focused in therapy of like ERP that we don't sit back and sometimes do some of that motivational work of looking at the bigger picture and like why we're doing the ERP and the goals we want to set. And that's a big piece of treatment. We need to slow down and think about the why, and we need to really be bought into the why and be excited about it.
Really well said. I think this is a good one because this is a very tough one. What is the best advice to not engage the OCD thoughts?
Oh, I go from like a couple quick acronyms that I have. So one is solving gets us stuck, and two is compulsions make us more confused. And so I think the best way to think of it is that actually, like, we all know that when we engage thoughts, we become more stuck than before we engage them. And so I want you to think about that from the beginning, that like, okay, yeah, I really am getting pulled into like wanting to solve this and wanting to have some relief, but the relief probably isn't going to come from compulsions. And I may in fact start doing compulsions and then say, oh, I feel worse now than I did before. I wish I wouldn't have started these at all. And so it's really important for us to kind of slow down and think about, what message are we sending? If we choose to engage with our OCD, we are sending the message that OCD has power, that our thoughts are scary, that anxiety is dangerous, that we need to respond to it. And it just actually perpetuates the OCD cycle. Where instead, if we choose to not engage, right? Acknowledge, but not engage. That's really important. We don't want to suppress the thoughts or engage in distraction. We want to acknowledge the thoughts, but not engage with the thoughts, not try to solve them. That's when we start to really decrease the power that OCD has. And we start to tell ourselves, and we're able to send that message to our brain that, like, we're not afraid of anxiety and we're not always going to respond to it. And those are the really critical messages that are built into ERP. I think a lot of times we think of ERP as this just like standard approach we have to do, but it's really actually about the bigger picture. It's about the messages that we're sending. It's about the change that we're behaviorally making in our brain, and the way that we get to decrease and strip OCD from all of its power. And that comes from how we respond when it tries to pull us in.
I would also say always remember when that O becomes the C. So what I mean by that is OCD kind of presents a conundrum in the form of an intrusive thought, maybe a feeling, image, sensation. So if I have hit and run OCD and I just parked in my house and I start to think, the O might pop up and say, I think you might have hit somebody on the way home and you just don't remember. Whatever I choose to do with that information and the feeling that comes with it becomes the C. And so right at that concept is the best point to really not engage in the thoughts. What we sometimes do with OCD is make the mistake of sort of drive home and start to think, did I hit someone? And then we get in the house, we might turn to the news to see if a news story pops up about hitting somebody with the car. We might be cooking, but we're not very kind of mindful or present when our head trying to figure out. So when we start to notice that we're kind of not really paying attention, I always can tell when a client is doing mental compulsions because I'm talking to them and their face is just blank. They're not with me, right? they're miles away in their head. And I'm like, come back with me. Yeah, I'm like, come back with me in my room in the here and now. I'm like, let's realize that what you're trying to do is you're trying to solve a problem in your head. And that's what OCD engagement does, is it says, look, there's a problem that you got to solve. And we with OCD love to figure things out. And if we start something, complete it. So as soon as you're starting to see you drift, and that's why it's always good to know, we create these hierarchies mainly so we are recognizing what are our thought themes, what are some of the content of our thoughts, so that when we start to drift into a thought about hit and run, if that's my subtype and I'm always in my head doing compulsions about it, it's good to identify that and disengage from trying to figure it out. And that's where we kind of accept that, hey, I would choose to walk away from this information versus trying to discover and gain more information. Because like Liz was saying earlier, those compulsions cause confusion, never clarity.
Totally.
Yeah.
Chris, I want to jump to some of our live questions. We have one really at 10:30. How do you deal with BDD when you have visible flaws? I have a very asymmetrical face. I've been told this by many people, and I'm just not sure how to cope with it.
Yeah, so with body dysmorphic disorder, we may have visible flaws. The very definition of BDD is either somebody who has imagined or slight. And I'm sure that, a lot of times when my clients come in and have, I work with clients all the time where I don't even see their flaw, but sometimes it is very slight. Maybe it's a slight scar, or maybe there's a slight asymmetrical. My guess is those people that have talked to you about it haven't gone up to you, Kylie, and have just said like, oh my God, I can't look at you. Like, this is repulsive. You should isolate in home. But because you have BDD, the emotions and the thoughts around your physical appearance is so intense. And I wanted to write a blog article about this because in the BDD SIG, when I talk to my clients, it's not just anxiety, it's disgust with them. It's shame. It's a lot of just like repulsivity of their appearance. And so one thing that we talk about when it comes to our appearance, when there's certain like minor flaws we don't like, is understanding the idea of radical acceptance. So the only way to quote unquote change something that we don't like typically is surgeries, cosmetic dentistry, etc. And that never goes well with people with BDD because we never like the outcome. We keep going and going. And that's when people have multiple surgeries at a young age. The other thing is, what is BDD trying to tell you is going to change in your life because of the asymmetry? A lot of times people will refuse to date, leave their house, order in public, etc. So what I work with clients is there's a bunch of malls in my house and we go out and we do the things that the BDD says they can't because of their, minor flaw. And they'll find that people are still kind, they can still eat in public, etc. So what we got to do is start to look and unpack, Kylie, what are the things you're doing or not doing because of how you feel about the asymmetry in your face, and how is it impacting your life to a point that you're creating it as almost sort of like this end all, whereas most other people that might, I think I've had clients with this obsession. I think pretty much everybody has an asymmetrical face. It's very rare that someone does, and we all kind of get up and live fulfilled lives. So it's not letting it impact negatively what you choose to do each day.
That's right. Next question is well, let's go pre-submitted. I think
I have a pre-submitted. I put it in our private chat. So I think this is a good one, especially for us to talk about as national and lead advocates. The question is, what is the IOCDF doing about stigma? I was diagnosed with OCD as a teenager, and the stigma and discrimination that I experienced, such as loss of friends, for disclosing caused me to have to change schools. So you've been helping the IOCDF stamp stigma out for a very long time. What are some thoughts you have about that?
You know, I want to say that IOCDF is doing incredible things, but really the work is you guys. It's the advocates, it's the individuals with OCD who every day are telling their story. We're joining webinars, we're speaking out, right? IOCDF is supporting that, and we're putting so much kind of emphasis behind the advocate program, which has grown drastically, but then of course also through educational programs. And both of those, I think, really make a difference in decreasing stigma. So for example, we have an entire IOCDF advocacy leg that Liz Lindley and others help oversee, where we really advocate on behalf of ourselves, on behalf of OCD, but underneath the foundation or the IOCDF lens. And then IOCDF has worked to develop so many incredible educational resources, whether it's the conference, whether it's the website, or our newly formed website, Anxiety in the Classroom, which is incredible. These resources are all made to provide appropriate education, appropriate resources and support, which in turn destigmatize OCD, right? Education and advocacy together destigmatize the illness. Treatment destigmatizes the illness. So really everything that IOCDF does, its entire mission, is also a stigma reduction mission, right? The mission to increase access to care, to increase education, to increase support, destigmatizes OCD along the way. And so what I will say is that there has been such a shift and a change in understanding of OCD, stigma, education from when I was diagnosed to where I am now. But there's also a long way for us to go, right? There's lots of work to be done that I think we're working hard to do. But at the end of the day, I really believe the big movement in stigma comes from at each individual person living or impacted by OCD. Because whether you're living with OCD or you're a family member, when you tell somebody else about it, when you share your story, when you put a face to the illness, that destigmatizes OCD, and it does it on a personal level, which sometimes has such a bigger impact than any grand scale or big things that we're doing. But IOCDF is doing it every day.
Yeah, I think, the IOCDF advocacy program, all of us, that's sort of one of our main goals. We may all have certain specific areas of OCD and mental health stigma that we're stamping out, but in general, that's what everybody's doing. And that's why, we've always talked at the IOCDF about diversity, because there's stigma in all different arenas, races, religions, in different locations, work, school, sports. And so there's a lot of people doing good work, but just like, Liz was saying, we may be doing stuff on on different levels, but I always say it's like opening up about it to your family, to your friends. A big thing that what I hear a lot of people do is if they have a presentation in class, doing a presentation on OCD, things like that can absolutely, change the tide. I have people in my grad school that still reach out to me and say, I would have never treated this client like this, but because you talked about OCD in school, some of the things they were saying made me think of OCD, and sure enough, that's what they have. So every single level of advocacy works.
Yeah, totally. Chris, you want to?
Yeah.
And I'm going to jump to you. I'm going to ask you questions.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one is it possible to do ERP at home? So maybe whether it's virtual, whether it's a workbook, et cetera, and be successful and have progress in it if the lack of funds or no ERP can be provided locally?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is that if it's possible to see a provider for at least a couple sessions to really get going and to make sure that you're understanding the treatment model, I think that would be ideal. There are so many incredible resources that are available now that didn't used to be, whether that's NoCD or web-based interventions. There's online conferences. There's all sorts of things you can attend that would be really important for you to make sure that you're connected and attending if you're doing treatment on your own. So there's incredible support groups that are led by clinicians. There's a lot of ways that if you're engaging in ERP independently, you can still have these kind of touch points or connections with clinicians and others in the field to just kind of get some feedback, make sure you're approaching it the right way. But there are wonderful workbooks and resources. I know that obviously we, through the IOCDF, we have ocdchallenge.org, and then we have so many different workbooks. Dr. Bramowitz has an incredible OCD workbook, and there's lots of different programs. I know Reed Wilson has a program that's online. And so there's lots of different ways you can be doing treatment. And what I would say is I think it's better to be getting some self-help and other ERP-based treatment than no ERP at all. But you do have to advocate for yourself. So I think a lot of times, and I was going to talk about this today in the talk with Fred, but a lot of times we think, oh, I call up Houston OCDI and they say that they're a self-pay clinic, so I can't afford them. But guess what? Right now, the only leg that I have no wait and I could see someone tomorrow are my sliding scale options. So I actually have current availability right here in Houston for outpatients that you would see a student who's being trained under one of us, who's going to do incredible care with you, but you could see them in a sliding scale for as low as $50. And so a lot of times these, you may not know to ask those questions. And so it's really important too that don't just assume that you can't afford treatment. Ask some of the big centers, do they have sliding scale options? Is there resources available for you? Because a lot of us and a lot of clinics do offer these resources and people don't even know about them. And I always think, I get so upset because I'm like, oh my gosh, the one thing I have openings on is sliding scale, which is what I think people need the most of. And the word's not getting out there. So you can call my clinic if you're in Texas and we can help you with some sliding scale options. Because even though sliding scale for us will typically say it's $50 a session, we could go as low as $5. And I say that because you can also ask. So if someone says a sliding scale amount that you can't afford, ask them if that's negotiable and talk to them about what your needs are.
What I would add too is there's such a great community. You hinted at it. I mean, there's the conferences, there's the live streams, there's affiliates that are holding local events. There's like Liz was saying, there's students that are being trained in Exposure and Response Prevention Act and other OCD evidence-based treatments. And so there's a lot of different ways. Now, I will totally agree with you that it can feel overwhelming. That's why I'm excited about our live stream with Fred. I think we're also doing another live stream in the future with Reed Wilson about different options as well. And so continue to kind of be here. That's one of the main goals, is to figure out how to make treatment more accessible to all. I know like where I work, we take insurance. So there's just different ways that we can figure out how to get you help, you know, reaching out to affiliates, reaching out to the IOCDF itself and asking about care in their area. So I know sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but that's one of the things that we're trying to do here and at the conferences is give you community. You can meet other people and figure out what are some of the things that they did that worked out and were helpful.
Totally. Next question. Is it possible for OCD theme to be about anything and everything? My OCD is taking the form of everything I see, listen to, and read. I don't know what to do, and I feel like I'm going crazy.
Yeah, so a lot of times in the beginning, I always say like content does matter, right? Because if somebody comes in and knows nothing about OCD and they've had intrusive thoughts about harming their kid for 6 years, if I walk in the very first session, I'm like, content doesn't matter. You know, they're going to feel very disconnected to the treatment. So obviously we worry about content. It helps us create exposures. It helps us identify triggering imagery and thoughts and things and stuff. Over time, what I try to work on with clients is looking at the mechanisms of OCD. Because I don't know about you, Liz. I know for me, my OCD has done every subtype you could name except a few that just never resonate with me. But it's been a lot of different subtypes. And so if I never quite understand how OCD communicates with me through cognitive distortion, through loudness, through urgency, through all these kind of tricks it uses, I'm going to keep, you know, I'm going to leave treatment being like, wow, I don't feel like I'm going to harm my kid anymore. But then I'm going to walk into hit and run OCD. Or I'm going to walk into sexual intrusive thoughts and then think I have to go right back to treatment. So what happens is sometimes in this question, what it sounds like is it sounds like you're running and chasing, you know, kind of like content like, oh, this is bothering me. This is bothering me. Take a step back and start to identify like, what are the things bringing on anxiety? What are the things I'm avoiding because of it? Or what are the things that I'm overdoing? And really work on some reduction of symptoms. But yes, absolutely, to answer your question, it can be about everything and they can make it hard. Some people are like, I can't even leave my house because it can be visual, it can be audio, etc. But it's starting to kind of create a treatment plan with a provider and really work on how can I get back into engaging in things and making sure I'm not making the mistakes of, you know, tripping up on my feelings because I'm being triggered.
Yeah. And this is really, you guys, why treatment is so important. Is that like before treatment, I'll hear people be like, oh, my car's contaminated, so I'm just going to buy a new car. And our response is like, contamination is going to shift and the next thing will become contaminated, because this is criteria of OCD. It shifts, it morphs, it jumps. And so, yeah, like it is never just isolated to one thing that we can just be like, okay, I'm going to do OCD for this one thing, but like everything else is going to just live freely. Like OCD attaches to anything that's valuable and important. And oftentimes we've talked a lot, I talk a lot about that like game of whack-a-mole, that we really, like Chris said, we want it to be about the bigger picture of what are the messages you're sending to anxiety, the messages you're sending to your OCD, so that it can't shift as easily. But if we don't address that, it will shift, right? If we're only addressing the symptoms and not the core fears, we can address that one doorknob and it's going to shift to something else. But we really want to address why it's contaminated to begin with.
Yeah, well said. And then that helps you from falling in that chasing trap in the future.
Totally. Next question is, can OCD make me hypersensitive to stress and anxiety or things in general? I have not been able to enjoy things I used to love, such as playing video games, listening to music, etc., because of it.
Yeah, one of the things when I talk about fight or flight to clients, sometimes people envision fight or flight only as like a panic attack or an anxious feeling. But one of the things that happens to us when we are triggered is we become very hyper focused. And OCD is a disorder that makes us very hyper focused. So, what a lot of people will do is, well, first, let me back up 1 second. There's also research, I actually put it in my thesis, of individuals with OCD have difficulty regulating emotion. So, we feel anxiety often much more intently than others. So, the combination of being very kind of hyper focused on how we feel, intense emotions, what typically happens is like when we're feeling triggered and anxiety, we start treating the presence of anxiety as a bad thing. And that can be a big mistake, because then what happens is people start to fear that feeling. And then they'll wake up and they'll start scanning. How do I feel? Do I feel okay? Oh, I'm starting to notice some stress. Notice anxiety. I don't want to be anxious today. What can I do to get rid of it? Oh, compulsions help. Compulsion. And it gets you stuck. So what I really work on with clients is we got to allot and sort of factor in that as humans, regardless of OCD or not, we're going to have anxiety and stress. The difference with people without OCD is they don't become hyper focused on it. They don't ruminate on it. And they have entrustment in themselves that they'll be able to handle stress through self-care measures and through other things. So with OCD, we can't be so hyper focused on every emotion, because as soon as we feel it, we fixate on it, we stare at it, we glare at it, and then that feeling feels more intensely. So once again, to answer your question, yes. And then what it's going to do when you're playing video games and listening to music is you're going to be more fixated on the feelings of stress and anxiety versus engagement in the activities you're doing.
And I don't know if you've ever felt this way, Chris, but like one of the things I struggle with sometimes is actually like when I first started to do pretty well and manage my OCD, I would almost get anxious about not being anxious. So like I would find myself like going to read a book or going to do like a quiet activity and not feeling super anxious, and then it would make me anxious of like, why do I just feel calm? Like, what is going on? And so again, it can attack anything and can go kind of in any direction. It's important for us to think about.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things I want to write a whole blog post or do a talk or something on like all the things to expect as treatment is going well. Because what you just mentioned is so hugely taboo based, right? How come I'm no longer stressed around being around children or around knives? Does this mean I'm now really want to kill my kid, or etc.? Or like you said, we're so used to having stress and anxiety be such a prominent experience in our lives and our days. And as we get better and we're relaxed and we're just like chilling by a pool, relaxed, it's like, okay, this doesn't feel right. I'm supposed to be freaking out and anxious all the time. And I think the other thing that it does is it makes us identify as like we're stressed and anxious people. But as we get better, we realize like, I'm really not. I'm kind of low key. I have moments that I'm relaxed. In fact, there's other people around me that don't even have OC that are more high strung than I am. So sometimes it kind of takes that away. So I'm glad you mentioned it. I hope everybody watching this it kind of keeps that in their brains, so that if you're starting to get better and you're not as stressed, don't panic about it. That's a good thing. We want that. That's why we did treatment in the first place.
Totally. Next question, and then we're going to move to live questions, is can you explain or show a difference between differentiating confession OCD with just wanting to be truthful? I love this question.
Yeah, what I always ask people is, what is the motive behind what they're doing? So for instance, like I have a value of being very honest. It's just something that I was raised with, is be honest, be open. Be very upfront about things. If somebody asks for my opinion, make sure I give it to them. Don't be mean, but make sure I give them truthful and honest feedback, because I don't want to be somebody that just kind of gaslights people, right? The difference is it's like a value. There's not a lot of stress about it. I don't overthink it. It's just sort of who I am. But the difference is, like, when we have OCD, which one of the subtypes, a lot of times when we see moral or religious scrupulosity, it's over confessing everything. And it's like, okay, if I'm not upfront and open about everything, that means I'm hiding and lying and not being truthful and being a bad person. I'm going to go to hell, or I'm going to get karma, right? The difference is, like, the whole motive of doing it is more of like, let me decrease my anxiety. Let me make sure that I'm like morally or religiously pure. And a lot of times we overlook social cues and overshare in a sense of being honest. So a big one I see this in sometimes is somebody that has relationship OCD and religious or moral scrupulosity. So every time they think somebody's attractive or have a sexual thought about somebody else, they'll confess to their partner, which, if their partner doesn't have OCD, finds it very jarring, and it's not even needed to be shared, right? Just having a thought about somebody else. That's what I'd go back to, is, why are you doing it? Are you doing it because that's a value of yours? Or are you finding yourself needing to confess everything because you're worried about certain consequences?
Totally. I think the one thing I always want to think a lot about is, what is the purpose? So if the purpose is truly to just have a conversation, or to like share something that's on your heart, and that you've just been thinking about, or that's important to you, that's very different than feeling like you need to share because it's urgent. And if you didn't, they're going to be upset, or you're telling a lie, or something's wrong, right? That's not really like the intention of being a truthful person. Is just that it's how you live your life, and like it's who you are in your heart, not I have to say these certain things in a certain way, and like there's this rigid, piece behind it. It's kind of like someone with contamination OCD telling me like, but Liz, I want to be a clean person. It's like, okay, well, like, you can be a clean person and not engage in OCD cleaning rituals, right? They can be two different things.
Absolutely. 100%. It always comes back down to the why, and often if it's like, well, because if I don't say it, I feel like I'm a bad person, or I'm going to be anxious all day. That's your answer.
Goodness gracious. Chris, do you want to ask them the next ones? I put them in the private chat because I think we've gone through most of the comments.
Yeah. How do you get a family member who's struggling with diagnosed OCD to be open to therapy and ERP?
This is so hard. This is a question Chris and I get a lot of. And, at the end of the day, the individual has to want it, and they need to want it more than we do, actually, right? They need to want it. They need to be open to it. And so I would always, first of all, encourage the family members to consider attending family support groups. Chris runs an amazing one through OCD SoCal, but to get support and to get feedback of other family members and community members to help guide you. But I always say that it starts with education, and it really starts with being supportive instead of forceful, right? We love you, we care about you, and I think we really we have access to great treatment, and let's help you get it, and let's help you get better. But also being open that treatment's not going to happen overnight. It's a long process, and being supportive of them throughout. I always encourage them to watch webinars, watch some of the things through IOCDF, because for some of us, we don't want to seek treatment, or I know I didn't want to for a long time because I didn't think treatment would help. I didn't believe it was possible. And then, of course, if they are an adolescent, you do get to make that decision for them, and you can take them to treatment, require them to go to treatment. And the great news is that they're a minor, and you have that opportunity to do that. You can't do that when they're older. But what I will say is that it's really important for you to do your homework first, so that you're getting them to a qualified provider who can really help. Because what we don't want to happen is, we don't want a patient to go to treatment, not be getting the right help, and then they don't think treatment can work. You've burned through resources, and they don't believe they can get better. That can be a detrimental process or thought process.
Yeah, I also think, there's something called motivational interviewing, which was done by a gentleman by the name of Miller for individuals with not wanting to get better from substance use disorders. And some of the concepts are things that I talk to clients about. They're in therapy, but basically only there because their parents forced them, and they kind of, walk in my office, arms crossed, closed body language, and they're like, I don't want to be here. I don't immediately jump into, well, here's an exposure and let's start doing, I slow it down at a pace that doesn't feel overwhelming to them. And I more so ask them, what is it that you want in life? I mean, nobody has OCD and enjoys it. When I see the statistics is in the 80% that individuals will have, 70 to 80% will have a depressive disorder. I'm like, what is the other 20% so dang happy about? Like, it's such a horrid disorder to have, right? OCD and related disorders. And so I always go back to, I was working with a client and I asked him like, what do you miss? And he's like, I really miss playing video games with my friends. I have a lot of friends from my old school and I can only talk to them through, I mean, I'm back in my day, we didn't have all this, but now you have headphones on and you're talking to people all over the world playing games with them. And he was just like, I really miss playing games with them. And I'm like, what if we don't do treatment? What if I just help you with some tools to get comfortable enough to go back to playing video games? And a lot of stuff was sort of magical thinking, having to tap things and have good thoughts. And we slowly worked on that. And he was able to get back playing with his friends. And he's like, that really worked, but I'm really scared to do treatment. I'm like, you just did treatment. That's what treatment looks like. It's not the scary thing you're reading on the internet. It's actually just some tips and tools to engage back into things you care about. So I think a lot of times your loved one with a provider or talking to somebody like Liz or I who have lived through it and having us dispel some of the rumors and have them reignite with the things they care about so that they're open and willing. And then I'd just say lastly, recognizing if the whole home is set up in a way that fosters strength in the OCD, you got to make some adjustments. So I've worked with parents where their loved ones are just chilling in their room, playing video games all day, eating, living the life, air conditioning. And, it's going to be really hard for them to want to get up and get better and fight OCD and live independently. So it's also kind of seeing what's going on in the home dynamics.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree.
Liz, I have a live question for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's from 1223 your time, Amanda, from Delias 13. What is your opinion, maybe professional or just you as an individual with OCD, about meditation for OCD recovery? This Delias is finding it helpful, and others have told that it's a great tool as well. Like, did you ever find? I know some people find it helpful and not. Like, how about for you personally?
Yeah. So again, we want to think about what's the function of meditation. And actually, I went to a great talk by, I think it was John Hirschfeld, actually, years and years ago in Atlanta when we did there was an affiliate conference and we were both doing the keynote. And I remember he was talking about meditation and mindfulness for OCD treatment. And I was like, this is such a hoax. I can't believe this is like happening. Like, I'm going to hate this talk. And it was so eye-opening to me because what he talked about is how actually mindfulness in meditation isn't that different than ERP. You don't go and engage in mindfulness where you just expect to have this quiet headspace and things are just totally zen and perfect. Actually, mindfulness is the act of allowing thoughts to come in, choosing not to engage with them, and allowing them to go out. And when you think about the ERP process, it's the same thing, right? You have a trigger, you don't engage with it, you acknowledge it, and eventually it will go away because you're not feeding it, and it doesn't have the power to stay loud and to stay big. And so I think mindfulness can be an incredible tool. And I think for a lot of people, they find it to be a great part of recovery for them, and also a great, I don't know what you want to call it, but exercise of your mind, right? An ability to practice these tools. What I want to caution you is to make sure we're not using it to distract or avoid, right? Like, oh, I'm feeling triggered. I can't experience anxiety. I need to go do mindfulness to feel better. And so again, with anything, it's what are we using it for, and what is the function of it? If the function of it is to be able to practice tools and to see how we do, great. Or if it's to engage in mindfulness because it's meaningful and value-based and we love meditation or mindfulness, amazing. But if it's to distract ourselves or avoid OCD thoughts, then it can become not as good in treatment, or it can become kind of detrimental. So we have to, again, what's the function?
You answered it well clinically. So I'll just say from a personal experience, I didn't do mindfulness in my treatment or any meditation. I mean, I had mindfulness, obviously, but I didn't actively do meditation. But after my treatment, one of the things I wanted to re-engage in was martial arts. I've done martial arts my whole life. And that I partially, so at conferences, if anybody messes with Liz, I can like kick their butt. But I've done my, martial arts my whole life. And so one of the things that my dojo really, really focused on was we would do a meditation at the start of martial arts, our sessions, and at the end. And what I found that was really helpful is it helped me kind of quiet my mind. It helped me be very present, very kind of like here versus like all spacey. And so I think what I ended up using it as in OCD treatment is a lot of times I'd be at work and start to ruminate about a past thing or start to worry about a future thing. And I would just simply tell my brain, I was like, those things may happen and I'm going to trust future Chris to handle it. And if I can't handle it, hopefully somebody in my life will jump in and help me handle it. But there's no power that I have in this moment except to engage in work or whatever it was I was doing. So once again, just like Liz said, as long as you're not using it as like a anxiety reduction after an exposure, if it's something that's great for just general wellness and how, mental health, awesome.
Totally. Some of the next questions, I want to kind of combine them really quickly and I'll answer them. And Chris, you can, but we have a lot of different questions about, is hypnotherapy useful? What sort of treatment is good? What is an obsession? So I just want to give kind of a quick overview, a 2-minute elevator pitch. OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessions are unwanted intrusive thoughts. So these are thoughts that don't bring us pleasure or joy, but that when we have them, we want to get rid of them. Compulsions are repetitive behaviors or actions that we do to try to get rid of the intrusive thought, to try to feel better. So we do these repetitive behaviors to try to ease our anxiety or distress that comes from the obsession. Evidence-based treatment for OCD to date is a combination of medication and specific forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. The most effective form of CBT is ERP, exposure with response prevention. And so, so ERP is to date the most effective intervention for OCD, and it's what I would recommend. Hypnotherapy and a lot of other treatments like that have not shown any efficacy to date for OCD treatment.
Yeah, just to add to that, what I would say is sometimes I have had parents reach out to me and say, look, like my loved one has done OCD treatment and medication. It hasn't worked. We've tried TMS. It doesn't work. They've tried caffeine. It doesn't work. We're looking at hypnotherapy supplements, but we're not seeing change. And there's kind of like this runaround. What I typically like to do, because they'll reach out to me and I'll say, I just want to meet your loved one and talk. And so what I usually find when I have a conversation with that person, there's other stuff going on that's really preventing the treatment from working. Because if all of those things aren't working, I don't want the person to kind of shame themselves as like, I'm treatment resistant, things don't work for me. But I've worked with clients before. Sometimes there's undiagnosed autism, or they're experiencing a lot of depression, or to be honest, they're really angry at their parents and feel like their parents are trying to fix them versus seeing the treatment as them improving and getting their life back. So I think sometimes that's an important thing too. So if somebody's going to hypnotherapy or these other things that there isn't really any research to back it, I try to ask them like, what hasn't worked in the past, so that I can kind of like quote unquote diagnose maybe some of the things they did. Sometimes people will say, well, it didn't work. And I'll ask, did you go on medication? Yeah, I tried Zoloft for about a week. It didn't work for me. And I'm like, okay, we got to make some other adjustments. I'm going to read this one for you, Liz, at 12:26 your time. Amanda from Badhan on YouTube says, OCD says that I should answer any intrusive questions or thoughts from OCD as maybe or maybe not. But what if one of my fears does come true? I think I would go insane and wouldn't be handled the distress and shame. What's your suggestion?
Yeah, this is really a good question. I was actually just talking about this week in group, and I think that maybe not statements are amazing. And I think that they really tend to help us kind of generalize what OCD treatment should look like, right? We want to push the doubting disease with doubt instead of certainty, right? That's useful. But there's times they don't make sense, and there's times they actually are not very useful. And so this is why it's so important that you're working with a therapist who's doing individual work with you, and where you're really able to say, what makes the most sense for me? So for an example, if you have a fear, Chris, that you might have harmed your dog and your dog recently died and you feel like it was your fault and that you might have harmed them, maybe not statements around like maybe you harmed your dog, to where then you're starting to say, wait a second, like, I don't think it's true, but now I'm supposed to believe it could be true. That may not be really useful. Instead, we may focus more on like, hey, like, let's just assume we did the best we can around our dog's treatment throughout our life, and we're not going to solve and answer whether or not we may have made mistakes along the way, and we're going to move forward. And we might even purposely think about great memories with our dog or things we loved around our dog, because we may start to be avoiding any memories or anything. And so we really want to think about, does maybe not work in that circumstance. So Chris, I want you to jump in because you're way better at this, but I think about this a lot from a BDD lens, right? That like a lot of people who don't know how to treat BDD will encourage patients to do uncertainty and maybe not statements. And that actually can really just increase depression and isn't useful. And again, I get it from like a outside perspective, if you're not a specialist, why you're like, oh, like you're afraid of that, let's just help you face the fear and target it. But really, this is why it's so important for us to understand what's at the core, and would maybe not statements actually increase depression or make things worse? And is there other ways for us to still target treatment appropriately? So Chris, can you give some examples of how treatment looks different for BDD, just so that we can see another example of this in action?
Yeah, in BDD, what I would always start with the client is recognizing that part of the reason that they've come to their conclusion, it's different than OCD, because sometimes OCD you don't have any evidence of how you've gotten there, but in BDD individuals will say the reason that I feel like this looks the way it does is because I literally can see it in the mirror, I can see it in pictures, I can see it in videos. And so if that is not addressed, the client is always going to think that the therapist is just trying to gaslight them or distract them, etc. There's really good research that was done at UCLA under Dr. Fusner. There's some really good work and a good video done by a lab out in Australia. But what they've done is they've actually looked at the brain, and the part of the brain that processes images for an average person is the right hemisphere of the brain. But individuals with BDD, it's the left hemisphere. And the reason that's problematic is the left hemisphere focuses on fine details. It zooms in, it gets really good at complicated things. We're not supposed to be looking at individuals' faces that way. So somebody with BDD is not noticing their face. They're noticing every single feature as these small kind of like detailed things. On top of it, when they've done eye imaging and scanning, people with BDD don't look at somebody in the face and make eye contact. They scan around and compare to certain features. And when looking in the mirror, they zoom in and only focus on that perceived flaw. And then lastly, some of the research shows that people have a really difficult time reading facial expressions. And that's why when they go out, they're assuming people are reacting negatively. So in BDD, somebody has all this evidence that they're erroneously thinking they have an image problem when it's really just a processing problem with the brain. And so then I'm working with a client to recognize that the BDD is convincing them something that's not. It's having them shift their whole lifestyle, obviously similar to OCD, different compulsions like mirror checking or avoidances. What I'm also, I would say, instead of saying maybe or maybe not statements, what I'm really trying to do, and Scott Granite and I really talked about this in our presentation last year, is I'm trying to get away from image as possible. After we really work through some of the things I've already stated, I'm really trying to get the client to recognize is they're banking their image as almost like this ticket to be able to get into activities such as dating, going to the beach, and, ordering from Starbucks. So I want them to recognize that they're putting too much emphasis on image, and let's focus more on human relationships and engagement. And so it's a long process with BDD, but I've had clients come to me that said, therapists have them write out like, I'm ugly, I have a big nose, I have a big nose. And because their thoughts are already egocentric and they believe that, going that direction actually just makes them more depressed. And in fact, some of them have said, I thought my therapist actually thinks I must have a big nose, because why else would they have me write that? So it's a little bit different. Quickly about OCD, though, I've had clients where their worst case fear came true. I had a client who lost their ID, and their whole OCD was around their identity getting stolen. They actually had their wallet stolen from their car. And they were like, you know what, Chris, it was an inconvenient 2 weeks, but I figured it out with my credit card companies. I was able to handle it. And I was shocked that this thing I'd been worried about for so long actually wasn't even that big of a deal. So remember, OCD's telling you can't handle something and it's blowing it up. Most likely that incident won't be as big, and you got to trust that you'd be able to handle it even if it did come true.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really, again, if it feels like this is wrong and this doesn't seem right, like this isn't resonating and it's making me way worse and spiraling, talk to your clinician, because anything can become a ritual, and it also can sometimes become more detrimental than helpful. And ERP is not supposed to be a miserable process, right? Chris and I talk about this. It's not fear factor. It shouldn't be miserable. Should it be hard? Yes. Should it be challenging? Yes. But it should also be exciting, because you should be able to see how it's getting you closer to your values. If what you find someone's having you do ERP that's actually taking you further away from your values and making you feel way worse, I want you to say, hey, I think something's wrong. I don't. And again, this is why it's so important. We don't just use standard hierarchies in ERP. I don't just say, oh, Chris, you have contamination. All right, here's my contamination hierarchy. We sit down together. And it's goal-based, and it's going to be exposures that work up to things that are really important to you that you'd feel really excited and good about.
Yeah. And like you said, everybody has to find what works for them as clinicians. And I think that's one misunderstanding of ERP as well. We're not cookie cutter humans that are very like, this is the process, right? We got to work with some people. So there's certain things that clients love. And then a different client in my group will be like, that didn't work for me. So that's being flexible as well in treatment.
Bingo. Let's go to one more question and then we'll wrap up and give some ideas. So the next question is, I feel like I have PTSD from this experience and it makes me not want to tell people I have OCD. Are there any efforts to reduce stigma so people don't have to worry about living in silence? I think we've talked a little bit about stigma already, but maybe Chris, you could just address like what it's like when people feel like there was some trauma involved in the way people responded and how they can kind of recover from that in different ways.
Yeah, I submitted a talk with Kim Quinlan at the conference a couple years ago, and we literally and some other people, Jess Saber and Allegra Cassens, I believe, was the four of us. And it got rejected because we had talked about what it's like to have OCD and the trauma that comes from having it itself. And some of the trauma folks felt like that wasn't a good use of the word. So we resubmitted it as the emotional toll of having OCD. It got selected. We got great feedback because people felt it wasn't talked about. And whether we use the word trauma or we use the word emotional toll, just from having OCD, I mean, I'm going to speak for Liz in this because I feel like we've had this conversation before. For me personally, I don't think I will ever deal with something as difficult as having undiagnosed severe OCD. I mean, suicide attempt, isolation, not being able to trust my own brain, disconnecting from my family, being housebound, hours and hours of compulsions, not trusting myself, hating myself. Like there's been very rough moments in my life, but I've always been able to handle them. That was the one thing I couldn't handle. And so having that, the suicidal ideation, the depression, the isolation, if that's not an emotional toll, I don't know what is. And so a lot of people have also talked to me about certain traumas that they feel from their compulsions. So, I've had clients tell me like I was looking at pornography for hours upon hours of somebody of the same sex and I'm not even gay, but I did it because I was checking with OCD and now I feel very confused. I mean, our compulsions sometimes put us in situations that are completely against our values. So what I would say is that that's part of the reason that we have so much stigma is we have basically had our life fall out from under us. We feel confused, we feel depressed, we feel overwhelmed, all these different negative emotions. And so one of the talks I'm promoting all of our talks, Liz, but one of the talks that we're talking about, and it's a conversation we've had with Jeff Shemansky, is like needing to treat the whole person, because this is some of the stuff that individuals will talk to me. They're like, doing ERP is great, Chris, but I feel miserable. I feel disconnected from my peers. I feel behind. I feel like I've gone through just a lot of trauma. And so those things need to be addressed as well, so you can leave the treatment feeling whole again.
Yeah, and I think that this is just so important is that, I even see this with some clinicians, where when we're training clinicians, I think a lot of times clinicians get so focused on like, this has to be goal oriented treatment and we have to be doing ERP and we have to be, and it's like, yes, and we have to be treating the person. And if they show up that week and they are going through a divorce or they're like having relationship issues, we don't just get to say like, we're not going to talk about that, Chris. We're going to address your OCD today. It's like, no, today we're addressing like what you're dealing with and life, because that's actually what's really loud. And so again, it's this really big piece of like, in order for you and I to build rapport with someone where they're even willing to do ERP with us, which ERP is vulnerable, it's scary, it's challenging. I have to have a strong relationship with you and I have to have rapport and we have to have trust and we have to be willing to do an experience and all that stuff that goes with it. And so, I think it's a really important thing for us to talk about. I also think it's really important for us to talk about ERP and to talk about the good and bad of ERP and kind of what has happened lately where we're seeing people like be against ERP when really it's maybe like the language we've used or the misunderstanding of what ERP is versus is not really needs to be talked about, just like how we talk about what OCD is versus is not. The next question that I don't want us to cover today, but it's really focused on my therapist is kind of proposing a more psychoanalytic approach to my OCD, and I'm curious about this. And so next Lunch and Learn, Chris and I are going to be talking a lot about ERP and what it means and how you can best understand the model of ERP, how you can apply it to your life on a daily basis and what that should look like. Because I think that a lot of us are hearing a lot of new buzzwords. People are getting excited about new fads, but I also want us to caution of really, can we think about not getting so caught up in like, I need a quick treatment or a new treatment or a different treatment. And instead, what is the purpose of treatment? The purpose of treatment is that we truly learn how to change our relationship with anxiety and OCD. And the way we target that is going to be semi-specific, right? And at the same time, it's individualized, right? And I think some people are turned off by ERP because they think it's this, you're going to be licking toilets, or it's this, treatment model where we're going to be like having to think about worst case scenarios and accepting them as truth. And none of that is true. I think, Chris, we really need to break down what is ERP? Where does it come from? What's the behavioral reasoning that it exists? And how is it applied today? What does ERP look like 20 years later, right? We did that amazing talk with Lauren Wadsworth and others where we talked about culturally sensitive and really socially appropriate ERP, right? Values-based ERP. But I think now we need to talk about what that looks like in practice, and what are the things that you should expect versus not expect, and what is it okay for you as a patient to be saying no to? Like, this doesn't line up with my values. I don't want to do that, and I don't think I need to do that to get better. You have the right to do that. And I think sometimes patients feel like they can't say no to their clinician, or they can't give feedback when it doesn't line up with their goals or what they want, or it doesn't feel right. And I want to empower you that that's not the truth. But I also want to caution you to not jump to new treatments or fads, and instead to really say, hey, I'm a little confused by this thought process, or like, I don't know that that's the sort of treatment I want to do, but here is what I want to do because here's the outcomes I want.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. One of the things that I think a lot of us do, that I've been in this field, that continue to go to conferences, to continue to learn new things, to continue to read new books, etc., is how to keep massaging the treatment in a way that really resonates with people, and to be flexible. And so when I sit down with a client, I'm like, I don't want you to think of this as fear factor. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to come up with the biggest way to make you anxious and miserable, and I'm like, excited about it over here, like you are. No, it's really, to me, it's like, I know you're greater than what your OC is letting you live. I know you have passions. I know you have things that you care about. And the only way for us to get you back into that is to re-engage in the things that matter. And OCD is going to give you a million reasons why not to. But look at what has happened by listening to OCD. Now we're isolated, and our lives have gotten a lot smaller. So I think dispelling some of those rumors, that's the talk we hope gets accepted, because I think that we're so passionate about it because it's what gave us our lives back. We want people to make sure that they're getting kind of what it really is. I think that talk we did with Lauren Wadsworth and others really helped dispel some rumors, and I think continuing to do that is great.
Yeah, and I know we talked last week with Jeff Shemansky, and I'm hoping he's going to join us, because there's just so many things that those of us that have been clinicians in the field for a long time, we can say, yeah, we get why that made sense and saw when it worked sometimes, but like, it's our job for treatment to evolve. Treatment should become better. I shouldn't be doing the same treatment here at OCDI Houston that I received when I was at Menninger at 15. Treatment looks similar, and some of the things, sure, are still the same, but a lot of it has changed, evolved for the better, right? It's improved for the better. And that's important, right? It's important for us to say that, like, things evolve and things get better, and we better understand them, and we know how to better implement them. And my big push to you across the board is the treatment you're doing helping you understand how to completely change your relationship with anxiety and OCD? And does it help you see that you have the power to do that? That your behaviors reinforce your triggers, and that when we change our behaviors and we start responding differently to our triggers, they will have different power, and the power they have will fall apart. Again, the goal is not that we sit and we process, childhood. But do we need to get to the core fear that's underneath why this is a trigger? Absolutely. That is a critical piece of ERP. And so y'all hear me talk a lot about the dangers of like standard basic ERP versus like in-depth, kind of more intense ERP, where you understand the why, you understand the deeper part, you're picking the weed and you're seeing the root, versus you're using a weed whacker and it's going to grow back, right? I don't want y'all playing a game of whack-a-mole. I don't want you to feel like life is about just surviving and functioning despite anxiety. I want you to have freedom, and Chris wants you to have freedom. And we know that's possible. We just have to help make sure you either A, have the tools to get there, or that you can advocate for getting the tools you need to get there. And that may be an important conversation you need to have with your clinician. And so we'll help guide you on what that looks like. So please join us next week for our first Ask the Experts of February. That's so crazy to say.
I know.
February 1st. And so we'll see you all next Wednesday. Thank you, Chris, for joining. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I love you guys and just so grateful for this community.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick to everybody new and to everybody that continues to come back each week, we really appreciate it. Liz and I and the foundation are always brainstorming and giving you different ways to give you education, topics, and answers. I want to shout out Mitchie Fig, who's joining us from Twitch, because we love that we're broadcast on all different platforms. And just to let you know, Mitchie Fig, I got your question down. I put it down in our questions list. We didn't get it to today, but please come back next Wednesday, like Liz was saying, at 12 Eastern, 9 Pacific, and we'll answer your question. Thanks for joining us on that platform as well. And we'll see you later. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and kick Osity's butt, please.